There was a time when Pastor John Gray seemed almost impossible to stop. He had the platform, the charisma, the celebrity connections, the massive church, the television exposure, and a reputation for saying the kind of things that could turn an ordinary sermon into a viral moment. But then, behind the polished stage, something started changing. The church became tangled in legal disputes. Former staff members accused the ministry of serious financial problems. Gray faced intense public criticism over his personal decisions. His church eventually changed its name. And even after all of that, another question remained hanging in the air. What exactly happened to the ministry that was supposed to be unstoppable? Because the strangest part of John Gray's story isn't that controversy found him. It's how many different controversies seemed to arrive one after another, each raising new questions about money, leadership, trust, marriage, and the future of his church. And just when you think you understand the story, there's another detail that changes the picture completely. Today, we're going beyond the headlines and looking at the lesser-known events that transformed John Gray's ministry from a rising powerhouse into one of the most closely watched church stories in America. To understand why things became so complicated, you have to go back to 2018, when John and Aventa Gray moved from Houston to Greenville, South Carolina, and Gray took over the former Redemption Church campus associated with Pastor Ron Carpenter. The move looked like a major promotion. A huge church campus, an established congregation, and a pastor with growing national recognition. But what happened next was anything but simple. The building itself became the center of a bitter dispute, and the financial details were far more complicated than most people realized. Gray later claimed that the campus came with more than $13 million in debt and that his church had been left dealing with a financial burden it did not expect. Carpenter's side disputed Gray's characterization of what happened. So this wasn't simply a disagreement between two pastors. It became a battle over property, money, contracts, and ultimately who was responsible for what. And then came the number that made the entire situation even more difficult to understand. According to court filings reported at the time, the church had been paying around $18,000 a month in rent before Gray alleged that the amount was increased to approximately $70,000. Gray's side argued that this increase happened without a new lease being properly established and said the financial arrangement had placed enormous pressure on the ministry. Carpenter's side maintained a very different position. That distinction matters, because these were competing claims in a legal dispute, not a court finding that one side was simply telling the truth and the other was lying. But for viewers, the important question is obvious. How does a growing megachurch suddenly find itself fighting over a property agreement that was supposed to be the foundation of its future? And that was only the beginning. In January 2020, a former Relentless Church executive named Richard Travis Hayes filed a lawsuit against Gray and the church, alleging that he was owed more than $75,000 after leaving his position. Hayes had served as Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer, and according to the lawsuit, he resigned after observing what he described as serious concerns about the organization. Again, these were allegations made in litigation, not established facts. But what makes the story unusual is that Gray's church responded with its own counterclaims, turning what initially looked like a wage dispute into a much larger battle over the church's internal finances and management. The counterclaim contained details that most casual viewers probably never heard. Gray's church alleged that Hayes had arranged for church funds to cover a long list of personal expenses, including house payments, lawn care, utilities, pool-related payments, and car payments, while also receiving a housing allowance. Hayes disputed the church's allegations. But suddenly, the public was getting a rare glimpse into the kind of financial complexity happening behind the scenes at a major ministry. The argument was no longer simply about whether someone had been paid $75,000. It became a dispute over compensation, benefits, authority, accounting, and who actually understood the church's financial situation. And then there was another detail buried inside the same dispute. The church's counterclaim said Gray brought in a new accountant and CFO because he wanted to understand what the true financial picture of the church looked like. The filing also alleged that Hayes had been involved in arranging a substantial rent increase involving another property. These are allegations from the church's legal filing, but they reveal something important about the environment surrounding Gray at the time. The leadership transition had apparently created serious questions about contracts, finances, authority, and accountability. For a ministry built around trust, those are not small problems. But the financial and legal problems were only one side of the story. John Gray's personal life was becoming part of the public conversation too. And perhaps nothing illustrated that collision between personal life and pastoral image more dramatically than the Lamborghini controversy. Gray purchased his wife Aventa a Lamborghini reported at roughly $200,000, and the gift generated intense criticism. Gray defended the purchase by emphasizing that he was acting as a husband rather than simply as a pastor. To his critics, however, the timing and extravagance raised uncomfortable questions about the lifestyle associated with a public ministry. The argument became bigger than a car. It became a debate about what people expect from religious leaders and whether a pastor's private spending can really be separated from the public image of the ministry he leads. And then the story took a much more personal turn. Gray publicly acknowledged serious problems in his marriage and described his own conduct as emotional unfaithfulness. He later stepped away from leading the church while working on his marriage, family, and personal life. This was significant because Gray wasn't simply dealing with criticism from people outside the church. He was publicly acknowledging that something inside his own life needed attention. For someone whose ministry depended heavily on speaking about relationships, family, faith, and personal transformation, that created an uncomfortable contradiction that audiences could not easily ignore. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Gray's story is something that often gets lost when people reduce him to headlines and controversy. Gray has publicly described experiencing an extremely dark period in his life and speaking about suicidal thoughts. That disclosure revealed a side of the pastor that was dramatically different from the confident man audiences saw on stage. It suggested that beneath the public persona, there were struggles involving pain, identity, marriage, faith, and emotional health. That doesn't erase the controversies surrounding him, but it does make the story more complicated. The man audiences were debating online was also a person who had publicly described being in an extraordinarily painful place. And just when you might expect a ministry to become smaller after so many controversies, something unexpected happened. The church didn't simply disappear. Instead, it continued operating, and in 2024 it underwent one of its biggest transformations yet. Relentless Church announced that it would become Love Story Church. The timing was striking because the rebrand came after Gray returned from a 2-month sabbatical. Gray described the transition in a memorable way. Relentless had been the chapter, but love was the story. Church leadership presented the change as a new direction and a renewed emphasis on love, community, and the experiences of people who had felt judged or disconnected from church. But there's another layer here. The church's own explanation suggests the rebrand wasn't merely about changing a logo or putting new letters on a sign. Gray and Aventer described a desire to reconnect with people who had become uncomfortable with traditional church culture. Gray argued that the church of previous generations couldn't simply operate in exactly the same way in the 2020s and beyond. That means the name change can be interpreted as something bigger, an attempt to redefine what the ministry represented after years of intense public scrutiny and internal difficulty. And the timing of that transformation is what makes the story especially fascinating. Gray had just completed a 2-month sabbatical, and reports about the rebrand connected that period with personal reflection and unresolved issues from his past. Instead of returning and simply announcing business as usual, the ministry came back with a new identity. That creates a question many viewers may not have considered. Was Love Story simply the next chapter of the same church, or was it an attempt to create an entirely different emotional identity after everything that had happened before? We can't know Gray's private motivations unless he explicitly states them, but the timing is undeniably interesting. Then, in 2023, the church faced something completely different, a ransomware attack. Relentless Church experienced an online breach and brought in a security team to investigate and protect private information. The church did not publicly disclose exactly what information may have been targeted, whether any information had been compromised, or whether a ransom had been demanded or paid. Gray responded publicly, framing the incident in deeply spiritual terms. It was another reminder that running a major modern church is no longer just about sermons and Sunday services. It also means dealing with cybersecurity, sensitive data, technology, finances, legal exposure, and the complicated infrastructure of a large organization. And here is where the story gets especially difficult to categorize. Despite all of the controversies, legal battles, and public criticism surrounding Gray's ministry, the church has also emphasized community outreach. In 2024, Gray told the Greenville News that the church had distributed more than $1.7 million worth of groceries during the previous year. That detail matters because it complicates the easy version of the story. If you only present the scandals, you create one picture. If you only present the charitable work, you create another. The reality appears far more complicated. A church can face criticism and still provide meaningful services to its community. A pastor can make serious mistakes and still have people who believe deeply in his ministry. And that tension is precisely what makes John Gray's story worth examining. Today, Love Story Church still identifies John Gray as its lead pastor, with Aventer Gray serving as co-pastor. The church's official website continues to promote services, events, community, compassion, discipleship, and unconditional love. So if someone tells you John Gray's story simply ends with scandal, that would be incomplete. He didn't disappear. His ministry didn't simply collapse. Instead, it changed names, changed its messaging, survived years of public controversy, and continued operating. And that is what makes the title "Things Aren't Looking Good for Pastor John Gray" more complicated than it first appears. Because the question isn't necessarily whether John Gray is finished. The evidence doesn't support saying that. The real question is whether the man who emerged from all these controversies can rebuild the level of trust and credibility he once had. Can a ministry repeatedly survive financial disputes, legal battles, personal controversy, public criticism, and a complete rebranding without those events permanently changing how people see its leader? That is a much harder question. The most revealing detail may be that almost every chapter of the story eventually comes back to the same word: trust. Trust between pastors. Trust between church leadership and staff. Trust over money. Trust over contracts. Trust inside a marriage. Trust between a pastor and his congregation. And finally, trust between a public religious figure and the audience watching from the outside. Once that trust is damaged, rebuilding it takes far more than a new name or a new building sign. And perhaps that is why John Gray remains such a fascinating figure. He has experienced extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary pressure. He has publicly acknowledged personal failures. He has defended controversial decisions. His church has fought major legal disputes. Former employees have taken their grievances to court. The ministry has faced technological attacks. And then, after years of turmoil, the same church announced a new identity built around love, community, and a fresh beginning. None of those facts alone tells the entire story. But together, they reveal a pastor whose public journey has been far more complicated than the polished sermons and viral clips might suggest. So, is this really the end of John Gray's story? No one can honestly say that. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. Love Story Church remains active, Gray remains its lead pastor, and his ministry continues. But the bigger challenge may no longer be building a platform. He already knows how to do that. The challenge is rebuilding something far more fragile: confidence. Because audiences can forgive mistakes. They can survive controversy. They can even accept a new beginning. But once people start questioning what happens behind the curtain, every new chapter has to answer the questions left behind by the previous one. And maybe that's the real reason people are still watching John Gray. Not because they want to see another pastor fall. Not because they want another scandal. But because they want to know whether someone who has been through this much pressure can genuinely reinvent himself, rebuild his ministry, and convince people that the next chapter really is different. The name is now Love Story. The mission emphasizes grace, community, compassion, discipleship, creativity, and love. But a new name can open a new chapter. It cannot automatically erase the old ones. So now I want to hear what you think. After everything we've covered, the church property dispute, the financial allegations, the former executive's lawsuit, the public relationship controversy, the Lamborghini backlash, the sabbatical, the ransomware attack, and finally the transformation from Relentless Church into Love Story Church, do you believe John Gray has genuinely turned the page? Or do you think the questions surrounding his ministry are still unresolved? Because there is a huge difference between surviving controversy and actually moving beyond it. And sometimes, the hardest part of rebuilding isn't getting people back through the doors. It's convincing them that what happens behind those doors has truly changed. If you found this story surprising, don't just leave yet. Subscribe to the channel, because we're going deeper into the stories behind the biggest names in church culture, the details that rarely make it into the polished public narrative. And if you want us to investigate another pastor, gospel star, or religious figure whose story has more layers than people realize, drop their name in the comments. Your suggestion could become the next video. Until then, remember, public images can change overnight, reputations can take years to build, and sometimes the most important part of a story isn't what happened on stage, it's what happened when the cameras were gone.